So today I'm going to see if I can try to make one of my favorite Mortal Kombat characters, Johnny Cage, from the original Mortal Kombat, using this Iron Fist. I want to make sure I get some good shots of him in his original form, so we'll be able to compare later what he ends up looking like. So Johnny Cage is actually going to be pretty simple. He's already got the sash. Iron Fist already has a sash, and the most complicated thing's probably going to be just sort of sculpting Johnny Cage's hair and doing his nose and ear detail. That'll probably take the longest amount of time. Other than that, I have to build some wrist guards on his arms with some spikes, and I'm basically going to be painting most of the red parts, the color of his skin. And then I'm gonna take this big collar off. So let's get started and see how fast I can do this. Right, let's start by removing this collar. We're gonna heat it up and then pull it off with some pliers. Came out pretty cleanly. Pretty strange looking shoulders there. Let's take this off. Now to grind off all the mask detail with this Dremel. You know, when you use the Dremel to take off plastic parts of a figure, you'll get kind of thin shavings that hang on. So I like to take a razor blade and cut them off. Now I'm poking a belly button hole so that the epoxy putty will stick. And doing the same for the nipples now. Now I'm going to apply some epoxy putty to make the chest details. Epoxy putty is a clay-like modeling compound. You've got two parts, two different jars. You mix an equal amount from each one. You sculpt with it like you would any other clay. And then depending on which specific epoxy putty that you got, some can stiffen up in just a half hour or less, and some will take several hours. And of course it takes a full 24 hours before it completely cures. I've been using the putty here to rebuild the nose and the eye area. And now the ears. This epoxy, it's called Fix-It Sculpt. This one actually cures pretty quickly compared to a lot of them. And so you don't have that much time to get it looking the way you want it before it becomes unworkable, which is fine. If you really need to go back and change something, you could always take the Dremel and scrape that detail off and then add more. Well, that's looking interesting. Now adding the epoxy for the nipples and for the abs. So before I really dug into the base figure's body so that the epoxy would have something to hold on to. If this video appears to jump in progress sometimes, it's because I was working off camera, not knowing it. Just, there's certain times when I don't know, you just kind of really need to get your face in there, and I do that, and I don't realize that I'm not under the camera, so that's what happened. For nipples, I like to make a small sphere and then flatten it against the chest and then use a sharp tool in order to pull out the nipple part of it. Finishing up the abs. You'd probably tell much of this happened off camera already. Don't know if you noticed, but his head's been really loose and rotating all around as I've been doing this. So another thing that happened off camera is I fixed that. I popped his head off and I just stuffed a little bit of plastic up in there. So now it's pretty tight. Just sculpting his shorts now. One thing I usually like to do is you see these little bolts, the joints for where his legs move. I like to cover those up. Doesn't affect how it poses, just makes it look a little smoother to me. So I'll just stuff epoxy putty into each of the little joint areas, and it doesn't really have to be an incredibly smooth job because I'll go back in with a Dremel and flatten it out and make it perfectly smooth. You can also see that I've filled in the holes where his collar was attached. There were quite a few of them and it looks pretty bad, but that's another thing happened off camera, just plugging all of those collar holes. Now just going back and blending his shorts detail into his leg. In better made figures, the articulation will be hidden with clothing. So on this Iron Fist figure, you see where his wrist ends and his sleeve begins? That's where our rotation point is. And same with his pants. Where his pants end, the rotation begins, and then the rest of his leg. So if this were a commercial Johnny Cage figure, you would probably see the rotation for his leg down at his ankle, where the shoe starts. Now adding the wrist guards. Here's another thing where the rotation was where his sleeve ended. But of course the wrist guards are a little bit longer than that. So part of them will have to be on his upper arm and part of the rest of them, most of them, will be on his lower arm. Fortunately, they're divided into these 4 straps, so I think if I cut the rotation after one of the straps, it won't look bad. Now the rotation being in the middle of his shin like that though, that looks pretty bad. So I may actually fuse that together so that it can't rotate there. I don't know though. You'll see me every once in a while dipping the sculpting tool into this little cup of water. Adding water to the epoxy putty really helps smooth it out. Now I'm just reinforcing the individual straps on his wrists. Looking pretty good, I think. And now carving the straps into his right wrist guard. Alright, with all that done, I'm going to start making his hair. For the hair, I'm going to use an epoxy with a much longer working time. In other words, it'll take a lot longer to cure, to stiffen up. So I'll be able to sculpt with it for actually a few hours. I'll just start by roughly covering the head with it. And now I'm just taking a sharp clay sculpting tool and cutting lines into the hair. Well, actually, if you want to tell which epoxy is which when you're watching the video here, the lighter one is the Fix-It Sculpt, which is the stiffer one with the shorter cure time, and the darker one you can see I'm putting on his head is has a cure time of about maybe like 3 hours. And it's good to have different ones because they'll have different applications. If you need to make thinner, gravity-defying pieces, you want the Fix-It Sculpt. That was useful for making the straps on his wrists because I've got these well-defined areas, and it's fairly simple, and I wasn't going to spend too much time on it. With his hair, I want a little more time to work with it. Pretty straightforward, just cutting lines in the direction that his hair goes. All right, I think I can live with this. Now adding his shoes. I'm just gonna fly through this because it's not all that interesting. You can see the metal parts on his wrist guards just appear because I filmed those mostly off camera, so I couldn't use any of that footage. Alright, we're done with the sculpting. Come back soon to see me paint this. But first, let's do a quick before and after comparison here.